Welcome to the Future.Bible Podcast, where you'll hear profiles of individuals and Bible-inspired organizations making a difference in the digital world. In each episode, we'll bring you stories of innovation, advancement, and real-life change. Are you ready? Let's get to today's episode.
Hey, welcome friends to the podcast. This is Kenny Jang, co-host of the Future.Bible show with DJ Chuang. Welcome, DJ. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. And I'm so excited for our guest today because we're going to geek out on podcasting.
Yes. What we like to do in this show, if you're new here for the first time, is we like to bring on interview with leaders and innovators and entrepreneurs, people, all the people that are relevant to the intersection of Bible and technology. We love to look ahead, but we also like to see what's happening right now in the space. And so DJ and I like to have fun traveling across the globe, as we say, meeting our friends across the internet highway. Today, we've got a really special guest. I think this is one of those things where we are looking at the plumbing of the technology and the things that we're doing to make things happen and expose more people to the Bible and Scripture. Rob, thank you so much for joining us from Libsyn. How are you doing today?
Gentlemen, thank you so much for having me on.
Before we get started, why don't you just do the baseball card stats? Tell us who you are, what you're doing, what your role is over at Libsyn, and what is Libsyn for those maybe 2% of the world that hasn't heard of you guys yet?
I am the VP of Podcaster Relations at Libsyn. I am a podcaster. I've been podcasting since the late in 2004. So I've been doing this over 14 years. And Libsyn is a podcasting hosting company, the largest podcast hosting company when you look at number of downloads and active episodes that are out there. And Libsyn's been hosting podcasts since also late 2004, the first podcast hosting company. And we host a lot of the big names that you may be familiar with. We host Joyce Meyers. We host Kenneth Copeland, Dave Ramsey, are just some of the ones that host with us that your audience would know of. And host the church I go to, Life Point Church. So Pastor Norris's podcast is there too. So got a little plug in.
Did you have anything to do with that, or was he podcasting before you got there?
No. I bugged him to do a podcast, trying to get him to go. Yeah, no. 1 year, even for Christmas, I bought him a Yeti mic. So bought him a Blue Snowball way back when. But yeah, I had a little bit to help pushing him that way.
That's always good to hear. We are. DJ and I are champions of podcasts, being involved with multiple podcasts over the years. And let's just talk about the podcast and relevance to the church in itself. I think a lot of people are surprised to hear that, and correct me if I'm wrong, that Christianity, religion, spirituality, faith, that is actually the largest category of content that you guys are hosting, or iTunes is putting out there?
Right. We have over 50,000 shows that are hosted with us active. And of that, over 15%, or right around 15%, are faith-based. And it's every faith you can think of, but Christianity is by far the biggest of the faiths-based. And many of them are just repurposed sermons, but there's nothing wrong with that. But then there's a lot of religion or original content that are faith-based. There's a comedy podcast, the Bad Christian podcast, where they talk about faith, but they maybe drop a few F-bombs here or there. And there's others like that, but there's quite a few, bigger names, as I mentioned earlier. Joyce Meyers and Kenneth Copeland have their content out there as well, so they get obviously some good numbers.
That's amazing. And then I guess the first step that I recommend to most churches is just, if you're recording your sermons, to get it out there on the platform and just see what happens. Is that typically the first step if a church comes to you and say, hey, we are interested in podcasting? What's the first suggestion that you might have in terms of category content or the genre, or what's the first step?
I'll ask them what they're going to do. Are you repurposing? If they are, obviously just put it in the main category in Christianity, if it's a church, and have it in that way. But sometimes, we have some churches that will have multiple podcasts. So what they have is one is their sermon, and then the next one they'll have another series is the youth group. And they'll have the youth group record each Wednesday when they get together. And then they have another one for a Bible group that gets together and talks about the Bible, and they record that. So they'll have maybe 3 different podcasts going that are on different. Sometimes they'll combine them all in the same feed. Sometimes they'll have different feeds for them, each one. So it just depends really what you're looking to do. The beauty about having the sermons repurposed is people go, oh, well, you know what? I make the sermon. It streams live when it's happening. Well, if they're not there, there's a good chance they're not there because they couldn't watch or go to it, see it live as it is. They had something else coming up. It could be a kid's soccer game is scheduled for that time, or a kid's basketball game, whatever it is. They might have a sporting event. They couldn't make it to church because of whatever the event was, or they're out of town. Now they can listen to it while at their leisure, the sermon they missed during the week. It's on demand. I think that's the beauty of podcasting.
Yeah, what I find amazing about podcasting is also not just amplifying the voices that already have a big platform through conferences and books and larger churches, but it's also opened up this huge opportunity for what might be called narrowcasting, that people can find a voice with just a small audience of a couple hundred. And have you seen that being a big part of your Libsyn?
Oh yeah, we've got some really narrow cast opportunities, podcasts. And there's one called the Chameleon Breeders Podcast, which is not for people that own chameleons, but for the people that are breeding the chameleons that you're going to go then buy. There's one called the Swinecast for professional pig raisers. There's a bird call radio podcast for learn about bird calls. There are very niche topics. If you will have a niche, you will be able to find probably a podcast or two or three on that niche. And that's the beauty. I mean, a podcast for chameleon breeders actually gets 800 downloads per episode, which is a huge number. I mean, how many chameleon breeders do you think there are in the world? Right? I can't imagine there's that many. But this guy's got an audience of about 800 and actually monetizes it because of that. But not everybody, it's not always about monetizing. That's the beauty of podcasting. You don't have to monetize. You can just be doing a podcast to get the word out that you want to spread.
Well, I love the fact that the economics work out, right? That you look at Libsyn fees, they are affordable. Almost anybody who wants to start publishing and start to build a tribe and audience and community can do it. And I love that fact that you've basically democratized the technology and the access to publishing so that it, right? And the thing is, people still think it's some magic or some huge production on the back end that's needed, or you need to invest in, $1 million setups for studios, et cetera, to get started. But really, you and I can start a podcast today on the streets with our smartphone, right? And it's accessible to everybody.
Yeah, and you don't have to spend much. I mean, with Libsyn, it starts at $5 a month.
Yeah.
And it goes, 75 to 75 on our Libsyn.com service. And we've been presenting at NRB, or an exhibitor there, for many years. And I was asking someone last year, I go, I noticed some of these radio station folks get mad at us here. Why is that? And they go, oh, well, there's some radio stations out there that they make their money off of churches, charging them exorbitant fees. And these people are now realizing they can get their message out to a wider audience as a podcast than they were paying a radio station for 1 month. They can do 10 years of podcasting. So, I can see how some people that have these for-profit, quote unquote, religious stations that are really just taking money in an onerous way from people that are trying to get the word out. And podcasting definitely breaks that down.
Let me just ask that one question about that type of model of publishing. So technology has democratized everything on both sides, and one question is a mass media channel, kind of like radio or television, is that just going to die? Is radio going to die? Because at some point, streaming media is going to be available and present in every single device that we have. And then the other question I have is, what do you do with live experiences? Because I think shared experience is still something that people want and crave in terms of our human nature of, right? Just having some shared experiences. Is Libsyn going that way? Are you going to ever, or is there a capability to have some type of live broadcasting over the Libsyn?
We have no plans for live, and what we see, and I'll tell you why. What we see in live is people that do a live show and also have it available as a podcast. They will get 200 downloads after the fact for every one person that's there live, and everybody that's there live, 100% of the people there live would listen to it after the fact anyway.
Right. Right.
So for the podcast, it doesn't, in podcasting world, doesn't make a lot of sense to have that live. Now, most people can't do a good show live. They need editing. I think a mistaken nomor out there is that you can just go out and do a live show and be good at it. They see, Adam Curry, or they see some people that are real professional folks doing these live shows, hit record, hit stop, and done. They are really, really talented. Most people don't have that talent, and it takes a little bit of editing to make yourself look good. And why not do the editing to make yourself look good, right? Why look bad when you can make yourself look better? But there are times to have live. So don't get me wrong, there are still times to have live. Sporting events make a lot of sense for live. Per local and radio stations in local markets, they make a lot of sense because of local advertisers. Local advertisers work well with the local radio station, not so well with the podcast that's going out globally. And then you have to try to aggregate local ads into that. It's a little bit more difficult. So there are places where radio stations will still continue to flourish. Sports events, obviously being one, live sporting events, having that live event covering the local basketball team or local college football team or Major League Baseball team, and talking about it after the win or loss, usually more talking after a loss than a win, but having that available, that's still a place for radio. So I'm not trying to say podcasting will kill radio. It won't. But there are definitely places where podcasting is better than radio. And that is where, if you were trying to get a global message out, if you go try to buy airspace in every market in the US and then see how much that'll cost you, right? Mm-hmm. You're talking tens and tens of thousands of dollars, probably a lot more than that, to get into each market. Whereas you can spend $5 and now you have a global audience available to you.
Now, podcasting has really taken off in recent years, or so it seems. But you've been with Libsyn since 2007, and you've seen the growth of podcasting. And what has brought it so much recent attention versus being kind of unknown in the past and more of a hobbyist kind of thing?
A lot of the growth that we've seen in the last few years, especially in growth in number of articles written about it, it has been around the mobile area. Mobile smartphones have become, your smartphone has become ubiquitous. Everybody has a smartphone, and this is now a mobile device where you can get those podcasts. On top of the smartphone becoming ubiquitous, Spotify, now Pandora, have come into the space. So now it's really to the point where any place you listen to audio, you can now listen to a podcast. So having the smartphone really helped a lot, but it's still very skewed. Don't get me wrong; it's still hugely skewed iOS to Android, about a 5-to-1 ratio iOS to Android. And Apple Podcasts is still the majority of where people listen. 60+% listen through Apple Podcasts and iTunes. So that is by far number one. Spotify's number two, but they're less than 10%. They're around 9% at number two. And then Overcast is third, around 3.5%. Those are the top three places where people consume podcasts. But mobile, 86% of consumption is mobile devices.
Okay, so we're a new podcast. We launched last October, and we're trying to reach a broader audience. But that Apple Podcast little directory has a very small window for new shows to be discovered. So for not just for us, but for others that are trying to reach a broader audience, how do they get themselves to be more easily discovered? Because I find it difficult to navigate that whole Apple Podcast tree. Right.
So I always say that you'll hear people say there's a discoverability in podcasting. And what that really is a podcast, myself or yourself, saying my podcast isn't getting discovered. The consumers are finding podcasts through word of mouth. So word of mouth marketing is really how people discover other podcasts. The example I use is in the movies The Sixth Sense and Lone Ranger. Both of those movies were by Disney. Both had the Disney marketing team behind it. Sixth Sense had a $40 million budget. Lone Ranger had a $195 million budget. That $195 million, almost all of that went to marketing the movie. At the end of the day, Lone Ranger did $95 million in ticket sales. Sixth Sense did $625 million worldwide ticket sales. Why? Because people told their friends, go see this. And then on one movie. And the other one, they said, don't go see this. Right? Word of mouth is still the most powerful marketing tool out there. So discoverability in podcasts really comes down to you as a podcaster for initially kicking it off by finding your audience and then interacting with your audience and getting your audience to tell their friends and other folks about it. Good tricks to do on kicking it off is go to forum boards, go to message groups that are in your niche and contribute to them. Don't go in and say, hey, I have a podcast. That doesn't help. That's spamming. Go in and say, hey, answer questions. And more importantly, find out who runs those communities. Interview them. Find out who the community guy is that runs, the WFX community, as an example, and say, hey, we're going to be talking about Bible and technology, and that's what you cover in your magazine. We'd love to have you come on the show and interview them and get to be friends with the people that run those different communities. That's a great way to help grow your show. But
Excellent.
As far as, just making sure you have the right name in your show is so important, because Apple Podcasts is all about searching results are all about what's in the title of your show. So don't try to be cute. There was a podcast once time called the Cheese Doodle Podcast. It might even still be out there. It didn't tell you anything about what the podcast was about. Hey, if you were into cheese doodles, that would be the one you'd look for, and you'd be disappointed because it wasn't even about that. It was about a totally different subject. Don't be coy with your name. If your podcast is going to be about Bible and technology, make sure Bible and technology are in the title of your podcast. In any other podcast out there, what are the 3 words that you think people would search for Google AdSense? Make them the title of your show. And if that's not your title of your show now, change it. It doesn't take much to change it.
Yeah, that's great. And the thing is, as podcasting is becoming more mainstream and popularized, as smartphones are showing up in everybody's pockets, there's other brands that are starting to enter the space, like you said, Spotify, Spreaker, SoundCloud, Anchor. And in that kind of space, do podcasts need to be everywhere? Or does it bring confusion to people?
Okay, so there's where you host your podcast. So Libsyn is going to be a place where you would host your podcast, and then you want to distribute it out everywhere. So you want to get it out first and foremost to Apple Podcasts. By getting into Apple Podcasts, not only do you get the 60% from there, but then you also get Overcast, Shifty Jelly Podcast, Podcast Addict, Castbox, and a bunch of other podcast apps that pull from Apple's directory. That's about 80% of downloads. Then there's Spotify. Then there's Stitcher, which is about 2%, and then TuneIn and iHeartRadio. But if you host a Libsyn, some of these are destinations you just publish right out to them. Spotify, you submit right into Spotify from inside your Libsyn account. I saw someone that signed up to an account the other day, last week, and they signed up and were live in Spotify with their show within 90 minutes. So from 90 minutes signing up for an account, they had their show live in Spotify. Now, Apple Podcast takes a little bit longer to get live. You got to go submit to them. But the point is, it doesn't take long. There's not a lot of places you have to submit. Overall, 4 or 5 really are going to cover you for the majority of the consumption. But you should be everywhere. And you definitely, as Pandora is not fully open yet, when Pandora opens up more, you want to be in Pandora as well. Spotify, when we work with Spotify, we help them launch podcasts. And initially, we were giving them the initial group of shows, and it was like 300 shows. And one of the ones I put in there was Joyce Meyers. And they're like, oh, no, we don't see that. I'm like, no, trust me, Joyce is going to do good for you. And when we launched and Joyce did well, the first show they came back, a category they came back after seeing Joyce's numbers, do you have more of the religious shows? I'm like, yes, we do. Because they were very surprised. They didn't think the millennials would be interested. I'm like, no, there's a lot of evangelical millennials. I'm like, trust me on this. She's going to do really well for you. And she did. She was one of their biggest shows at launch. She was up there with Joe Rogan. Joe's not in there. It was another one that was up there. I'm trying to remember the name of another comedy podcast that was really big up there. Mark Maron, that's what it was. And she was like right neck and neck with Mark Maron as far as numbers go when Spotify launched.
Now, Spotify has gone even further in their commitment. They just announced this past week, right? The $500 million of investments in this category. Mm-hmm. What does that mean? I put out on my daily vlog, a little mini editorial reflection on that. I think it's going to do wonders for the industry, and that's the tip of the iceberg. What are your thoughts on that?
My thoughts are this: Spotify's already did a lot to get to number 2. I mean, there hasn't been a number 2 in podcasting since Zune. And that really, those of you who remember Zune, that's how long ago it was that we had a number 2 in podcasting. So Spotify's already done a lot. The 2 acquisitions they did last week, Gimlet and Anchor, are going to mean absolutely nothing to the average everyday podcaster. Gimlet is not that big. It's 24 shows overall, one of which is a recap show, and
Right.
then the other half haven't released new episodes in the last year. So we're really looking at a dozen shows. They get about 12 million downloads a year. I've got individual shows that host on Libsyn that get more downloads per month than Gimlet gets per month for those 12 shows. They get 12 million a month, not a year, sorry, about 12 million a month. So we have individual shows that are getting more downloads than all of the Gimlet shows combined. So overall, that's not a big deal.
Right. So you're saying you're on the other side of the fence, I guess, then. But don't you think that, I mean, there's a lot of attention that was brought to that news, and the fact that they're signaling they're not done yet, and just $500 million, I think, is a big number. Don't you think that there's going to be other people in the space, and also it's going to lead to, at least even on Spotify's platform, lead to user experience innovation and discovering, and just even how they're cataloging and presenting the shows and titles, etc.?
I think the bigger news is that they're committed to stick with podcasting. So it's not like, hey, we got into it, but they've been around. Maybe I'm biased because I've been working with Spotify for a couple years before they even launched. So I've seen the Spotify's commitment for the last 4 or 5 years into podcasting space. So I know that they were committed. I've talked with the folks, and I know the folks that are committed and they have podcasts. I think Gimlet's going to be more important to them longer term in creating original content that'll probably just be on Spotify, not so much the Gimlet content they got. Anchor doesn't really get them all that much. It doesn't get them anything in the way of content. Most of the shows on Anchor aren't even the majority of shows on Anchor actually are dead shows, not producing new content, which is well known. Most there's none of the shows. Matter of fact, none of the shows of the Anchor shows are in the top 200 episodes. Or top 200 podcasts in iTunes. And matter of fact, none of the Gimlet episodes were even in the top 100 episodes when you look in the top 100 episodes.
Well, Anchor just recently shifted to that podcasting thing too, right? So it's not like
they do.
They're not a behemoth in the podcasting. They're a newbie in the industry per se.
Right. They make it easy for people to create a podcast and get in. But the problem with podcasting has never been about creating a podcast. The hard part of podcasting isn't getting an RSS feed and creating the file. The hard part about podcasting is creating something interesting to say. And I think what, Anchor is a technology play, but it doesn't make it easier for podcasters to create good content. Creating good content takes work. And that's shown by the number of dead Anchor shows that there are. I mean, they have more dead shows from Anchor in iTunes than any other host out there.
Now, in terms of churches and ministries and individuals that are looking at this as a channel to adopt in terms of either remixing, repurposing their existing content or creating new content in a podcast form factor, what would you say to that audience that's listening here today? Because we're trying to figure out on the edge, people are always trying to prioritize and sequence their limited bandwidth, their limited budget, their limited energies. As an advocate for podcasting, how would you position that or champion that for someone who has that decision in front of them?
First off, I ask, are you trying to grow, or are you trying to just make it a convenience factor for your current audience? Right. So if it's just about, hey, I want to make what we have available, it's already easy. You record your Sunday sermon, and that can be as simple as putting a recorder on the pulpit and recording that. Right. Hopefully you have an audio board you can plug into and pull the audio out of that. But it just depends on the setup of the church. Most just have recordings anyway. Most people are recording their sermons as it goes. Now you just make it available as an MP3 file. You have to be careful though on the music that you have. You can't be repurposing music. Some people have music that they play in the sermon. You can't put that on a podcast if you don't have the rights to that music.
Right.
On that.
Right. UCLI is your friend.
Yeah. Now, if you're trying to grow, your Sunday sermon isn't usually going to be your best opportunity to grow. It might be. It depends on who you are. But you may want to look at original content. And again, that might be something where you have a series. Maybe you go more in depth than you would have in your Sunday sermon on a specific topic. Maybe you're going to talk about mental health or issues with internet porn or whatever it is that the subject that you were getting into, that you might want to go a little bit deeper. That may bring some attention back to you as the pastor and your church, and maybe even that your own congregation wanted to hear more of, that you just didn't want to, hold them over because, it was football season and you had to get them out the door before 11:30, right? Because the Chiefs were playing at noon. So there are time limits that you have on Sunday, realistic time limits, right? This gives you an opportunity to go a little bit further than, you don't want everybody nodding off.
Now, we see some YouTube vlogger pastors out there. I know Trey Van Camp is a friend, and we've seen him use that vlog medium to actually gain the awareness of people in his community and beyond. There's Justin Coe. There's a bunch of other Christian vloggers out there. Do you know of any podcasters out there that are explicitly using it as a growth engine, or trying to explicitly, from a church planting point of view, or even a nonprofit ministry point of view, if they're not a church, to grow their audience, their donor base, or things like that?
There are Hillsong is one. There's I'm trying to remember the name of the Elevation is another one that's doing a lot of podcasts, and what does Elevation have? Like 15 satellite campuses around Charlotte or something like that, right? So yeah, I mean, they're using the podcast as a way, as a communication device, to get word out in their market and beyond. So there definitely are churches that have been very aggressive with their podcast strategy, and when you see that, it's not about just repurposing content; it's a growth strategy.
Gotcha. Last question, I guess, would be, a couple years down the line, I want to say 5-10 years, but we are living in dog year cycles for technology and innovation these days. And it's only getting faster. But what do you think the next, I guess, evolution is podcast always going to be the form factor that it is today, or is there something that's going to break in terms of innovation to get to something new, fresh, something that's different?
Well, I think one of the things to note about podcasting is most podcasts, the majority, are audio. There's more time in the day to consume audio than video. And when we see someone that has both an audio and a video podcast, it's going to get 10 times more downloads on the audio than the video. There's more time when you walk in the dog, working out, driving the car to work, walking to the grocery store. You can be listening to a podcast. So I don't see that changing. If anything, people's lives gets busier and busier, and I think the audio has even a better opportunity, because you get to fill those small pieces of the day where they have an opportunity to only listen to audio and not do anything. And we still see more downloads during the week when people are going to and from work and at work. So I don't see that changing. Now, what I do see something changing in a growth point of view is right now, iOS to Android ratio is 5-1, iOS to Android. But there's 5 times more Android devices than iOS. That means the typical iPhone gets 25 times more consumption of podcasts than the typical Android device. And that's where there's an opportunity in podcasts for growth in the next 5 years, is on the Android side, with Android releasing a native app, hopefully at some point in the future. That's where we've seen Spotify help out, and now Pandora coming on board. So we're going to see more growth in the next few years in podcasting from Android's perspective, because it's just low-hanging fruit. We haven't seen anything there. I can't imagine that only people that are interested in podcasts are those that own an iPhone. I have to imagine that we're going to see the same amount of interest eventually on the Android side.
Yes, it's not only fanboys, Apple fanboys who listen to podcasts.
Because it covers every topic. I mean, there's even podcasts about Android. So Android Central has a really good one if you happen to get Android. Now, if you're on the iPhone today in iOS, I just have to put a plug in there that will. You don't want to listen to that though if you're on an Android, because I'm not nice to Android folks out there.
Well, I am just awestruck sitting here listening to you talk, Rob, because you're a podcast veteran, and it's obvious in your voice and your experience that you have a lot of depth and breadth in your understanding of podcasting, and you know how to think on your toes. You're a very interesting person. So to create interesting content, we need interesting people. And so thank you for making time to chat with us. And you gave us some really cool nuggets there in terms of how not just to launch the podcast, but how to better engage with our audience. So thank you, Rob, and look forward to seeing you at NRB this year.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for having me on, and please come by the booth. I look forward to shaking your hands and saying hi, and share some chocolate with you that we always have at the booth.
You always have a great booth. What do you know your booth number yet? They always tell us to say our booth number. I don't know what our number is.
Yeah, it's and I don't remember now. I'll start promoting it here in the next few weeks.
Yeah.
I think we're like 550 something.
We'll put it into the show notes for everybody. But definitely, I think make a game out of it. Come see Rob at the Libsyn booth, and come see us over at the American Bible Society .Bible booth.
And the number is 348. And NRB is the National Religious Broadcaster Convention. This year it's called Proclaim. It's in Anaheim, California, right across from the street from Disneyland. And March 26th to 29th, we would love to meet you in person as well. So thank you, listeners, for listening in, watching Future.Bible. And we are always looking for more interesting people to talk with, because we want to be the place where you can meet innovators ready to talk about how we can apply the always evolving world of technology to the never-changing message found in the Bible, call for real life change. So until next time, be blessed, and remember to be a blessing.
Thank you for joining us today. If you enjoyed today's session, please help us share this podcast with your friends, colleagues, and family members. You can do that by leaving a review on iTunes or by sharing our website, www.future.bible, with your network. Don't forget to join us next week for the next episode of the Future.Bible Podcast.